An obese 16-year-old was sold to Mountain Man as punishment by her father. But he had other plans. The air in her father's house was suffocating thick with silent judgment, stifled grief, and the brittle piety of a man who mistook cruelty for strength. Abigail knelt, her fingers carefully navigating the porcelain shards. Each fragment of her mother's shattered music box was a testament to her crime. She wasn't weeping. Tears were a luxury her father Corbin had long since beaten out of her. Instead, she moved with a quiet endurance, a small act of defiance against the worthlessness he branded upon her soul. She knew this wasn't just about the heirloom. Corbin's rage felt different today, colder, more purposeful. It felt like an excuse. She'd seen the shadow of the Mountain Man at the edge of town, a true bad egg, and a shiver of premonition traced its way down her spine. Then came the knock, followed by the low rumble of a stranger's voice and the final chilling clink of coins on the mantel. A soul being sold. Her soul. The punishment had arrived, and what shocking plans awaited her in the godless mountains ahead? The silence in the house was a weapon. It was a thick, heavy thing wielded by her father Corbin with the precision of a hunting knife. It followed Abigail from the shadowed corners of her small room to the heat-hazed square of the kitchen, judging the space she took up, the air she breathed. Today the silence was sharper than ever, honed to a razor's edge by the porcelain shards on the floorboards. The music box, her mother's last gift, now a constellation of white fragments and twisted brass. An accident. A clumsy, terrible accident. But in this house, there were no accidents. There was only failure. Corbin stood by the hearth, his back to her, a man carved from church pews and the unforgiving prairie wind. He didn't need to look at her. He could feel her shame from across the room. It radiated from her like heat from a stove. It slipped. Abigail whispered, her voice a thread of sound in the oppressive quiet. He turned slowly. His eyes were the color of a faded blue sky and just as empty of warmth. They swept over her from her worn dress to her trembling hands, lingering on the soft curves of her body with a familiar, cutting disdain. "Slipped," he repeated. The word was not a question. It was a verdict. Things of value have a way of slipping through hands that are careless, worthless. The final word landed a physical blow. She flinched, her gaze dropping back to the floor, to the porcelain ruins of the one beautiful thing she had owned. A hollowness that had nothing to do with hunger ached in her chest. She was 16 years old, and she had never known a day without the weight of that word. A heavy knock rattled the front door. It was a sound that didn't belong to their small, silent world. Corbin's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something resolve, anticipation, hardened his eyes. "Stay here," he commanded. She listened, frozen to the scrape of the door, the low murmur of her father's voice, and then another's. A voice like rocks, grinding together, deep and rough and sparing with its words. She heard the clink of coins. A heavy final sound. "What is happening?" Girl Corbin called out, his voice flat. "Get your shawl." Abigail moved as if in a dream, her feet numb. She stepped into the main room and saw him. The man. He was not just a man. He was a piece of the mountain given legs. Taller than the doorframe, wider than her father, he was dressed in buckskin and furs that smelled of pine sap and cold stone and something else. Something wild and clean. A thick, dark beard covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes, the color of a winter creek, watched her with an unreadable, unsettling intensity. This was Jedediah. The mountain man the townspeople whispered about, a specter from the high peaks who came down only for supplies and solitude. A true bad egg. A length of rope was coiled in his massive hand. What is this?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling as she looked from the stranger to her father. Corbin didn't look at her. He stared at the coins on the mantelpiece, his face grimly satisfied. "A consequence. You broke something of value, so you will learn the value of being useful." The cold dread in her stomach turned to ice. Father, no. He has need of a helper at his cabin. Corbin continued, his tone clinical as if discussing the sale of livestock. A strong girl. He said the word strong with a sneer. Jedediah said nothing. He simply uncoiled the rope. It wasn't for tying her hands, she realized with a fresh wave of terror. It was a lead. Please, she begged, turning to her father. She saw nothing in his face. No pity, no regret, only the chilling finality of a decision made. He had sold her. For a handful of coins he had erased her. Jedediah held out the end of the rope. Take it. Tears blurring her vision, her body shaking with a sob she refused to let escape. Abigail took the rope. She allowed him to loop the other end around his saddle horn. She was led from the house, from the only world she had ever known. The sun was a merciless hammer in the street. Faces peered from behind curtains. She was a spectacle. She did not look back. They walked until the dust of the town gave way to the cracked, thirsty earth of the plains. He never spoke. He never looked back. She was merely cargo, a breathing parcel he had purchased. As the sun began to bleed out across the horizon, the world grew strange and hostile. Abigail looked at the immense silent back of the man leading her deeper into the encroaching darkness, and she had no idea if he was leading her to a new life or simply to her grave. The world became a blur of aching muscles and the sharp taste of dust. Each step was a negotiation with the stones which bit at the thin soles of her shoes with a persistent malice. The rolling plains had given way to jagged foothills that clawed at the sky, their pines standing like silent, watchful sentinels. Abigail's life in her father's house had been a prison of the soul. This was a prison of the body, and she wondered which was worse. Jedediah was a relentless engine, his huge frame moving with an unnerving, ground-eating stride that never seemed to tire. He remained a silent silhouette ahead of her, a constant menacing presence against the horizon, pulling her deeper into a world she did not know. He was her owner. The thought was a raw, festering wound. On the second day, a gnawing hunger hollowed her out, leaving her dizzy and weak. They stopped in a small clearing as dusk settled over the canyons, painting the rock faces in shades of rust and violet. He built a fire with an efficiency that was both fascinating and frightening. From his pack, he produced 2 skinned rabbits, spearing them on a green branch. The smell of the roasting meat was torture. He ate one, tearing the flesh from the bone with his teeth, his eyes scanning the surrounding darkness, alert as a wolf. When he was done, he wiped his hands on his trousers, rose, and walked to the edge of the clearing to keep watch. The second rabbit remained by the fire. Sizzling. Perfect. She waited. For a command, for a sneer. For him to call her forward like a dog to its bowl. Nothing came. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the lonely cry of a distant hawk. He did not look at her. He simply sat his back to her, a mountain of a man staring into the night. Hesitantly, her hands shaking, she crept forward and took the rabbit. The meat was hot, life-giving. It was more than she'd eaten in 2 days combined. It was a kindness so quiet it was almost an accusation. Why? The question became a drumbeat in her mind, pounding in time with her weary footsteps. The terrain grew steeper, the path a treacherous ribbon of loose shale that threatened to send her tumbling into the ravines below. She fell once, her knee striking a sharp rock, the pain a bright, searing flash. She choked back a cry, forcing herself up, ashamed of the weakness her hands scraped raw. An hour later, she noticed something strange. The path directly ahead of her seemed clearer. Small, sharp stones had been kicked aside. A fallen branch that would have tripped her had been dragged into the undergrowth. He was doing it. While she trudged behind, lost in her misery, he was silently clearing her way. A ghost tending a path for a ghost. He never looked back to see if she noticed. He simply did it. That night, the cold was a living thing, seeping into her bones, and stealing her breath. He stopped and pointed a single thick finger toward a shallow alcove in the rock face sheltered from the biting wind. There he grunted. It was the first word he had spoken to her. It sounded like stones scraping together. She scrambled into the space, grateful for the small refuge. She watched as he settled himself by the fire, his broad back taking the full force of the wind that whipped through the pass. He had given her the only shelter. Abigail lay in the darkness, the hard rock beneath her, and did not sleep. Her fear was a constant companion, but now it had a new neighbor, a profound, unsettling confusion. Her father, who was supposed to be her protector, had offered only spoken cruelties. This monster, this brute, who had bought her like a sack of flour, was showing her a strange, silent form of decency. The roles of monster and protector were blurring into a terrifying gray. He was a puzzle she couldn't solve, and her life depended on the answer. On the fourth day, as the sun reached its zenith, he stopped on a high ridge. He pointed again, his silence returning. Through a break in the pines below, she saw it. A thin curl of smoke rising into the brilliant blue sky. A rooftop. A small solid cabin nestled in a clearing by a creek. The end of the trail. She looked from the plume of smoke to the unreadable back of the man who now owned her life. A new wave of terror, colder and sharper than any before, washed over her. The journey was over, and her real ordeal was surely about to begin. The cabin was not a cage. It was solid, built from pine logs the color of honey, each one notched and fitted with a craftsman's care. A thin plume of smoke curled from its stone chimney, a promise of warmth that seemed utterly alien to her. Jedediah stopped his horse, the creak of leather loud in the sudden silence of the clearing. He swung down, his movements economical and sure, and without a word, he unlooped the rope from his saddle horn. The tether was gone, but she felt no freer. He gestured with his head toward the door. An invitation, a command. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in the cage of her chest. This was it. The final door. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The air within was cool and clean, smelling of wood smoke, dried herbs, and beeswax. It was a single large room, but it was not the squalid den of a beast. A great stone hearth dominated one wall, its embers glowing with a low, welcoming heat. A rough-hewn table stood in the center, flanked by two sturdy chairs. Shelves lined the walls, holding neatly arranged jars, tins, and folded blankets. It was a place of order, a place of peace. It was a home. He followed her in his presence, seeming to shrink the room, yet he moved with a quiet reverence for the space, his heavy boots soft on the wooden floorboards. He pointed to a cot in the far corner. A thick wool blanket, clean and soft, was folded at its foot. "Yours," he rumbled the word, seeming to cost him a great effort. Then he took his long rifle from its pegs by the door. "Don't wander," he said, his gaze holding hers for a fraction of a second, a silent, unreadable warning. The door closed behind him, and she was alone. The silence he left behind was different. It was not the oppressive, weaponized silence of her father's house. It was an empty silence, hollow space filled with questions. She stood frozen for a long time, listening to the sound of her own breathing. Run, where the wilderness that surrounded this small point of light was a far more terrifying prison than any four walls. Her fear was a constant hum beneath her skin, but another feeling was rising to meet it, a desperate, gnawing curiosity. Her eyes scanned the room, truly seeing it for the first time. They fell upon the mantelpiece above the hearth. She had expected to see skulls, or perhaps scalps, the grim trophies of a savage life. Instead, her breath caught in her throat. Lined up in a neat row was a small collection of carved wooden animals. A hawk, its wings half spread, every feather etched with impossible detail. A fox curled in on itself, its tail draped over its nose. A tiny, delicate fawn, its spindly legs looking as if they might snap at a touch. The hands that had tied a lead rope around a saddle horn had also carved this. The hands of a brute had created this impossible beauty. The paradox was a physical ache in her chest. Drawn by a sliver of green seen through the single clean window pane, she tiptoed closer. Outside, just beyond the cabin, was a small, fenced-off garden. Not for vegetables, but for herbs. Rows of sage mint and other plants she didn't recognize, all tended with obvious care. This was not the work of a simple trapper. This was the work of a healer, or someone who had loved one. Curiosity finally won its war with fear. She slipped out the back door. The mountain air was crisp and cold-sharp in her lungs. The clearing was quiet, serene. And there, beneath the sweeping branches of a tall, ancient pine, was a single flat stone set into the earth. A grave. She knelt, her fingers tracing the moss-covered letters carved into the stone. The words were simple, their grief eternal. Martha, beloved wife, the mountains weep for you. Below the name, a date from 5 years prior. A wife. He had a wife. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, but they formed a picture she could not comprehend. This was not the lair of a monster. It was a tomb of memory. The beast who had bought her was not a beast at all. He was a grieving husband. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, and her fear, the simple animal terror for her own life, began to transform into something far more complex. It was a shared, aching sorrow. A twig snapped in the woods behind her. He was coming back. The snap of the twig was a gunshot in the silent clearing. Abigail scrambled back from the grave, her heart seizing in her chest. Jedediah stood at the edge of the woods, a dead buck slung over his shoulder. His face, usually a mask of stone, was now etched with a profound, soul-deep sorrow that was so raw it looked like rage. He looked from the simple grave marker to her kneeling in the sacred space of his grief, and his eyes darkened. She had trespassed. She had uncovered the heart of his secret world. "Get inside," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, each word a chip of ice. She fled. Back in the cabin, the warmth of the hearth felt like a mockery. The air was thick with a new kind of tension, no longer the fear of the unknown, but the terror of having discovered a truth too painful to touch. He came in moments later, dropping the buck with a heavy thud, and the silence he brought with him was the coldest she had ever known. He would not look at her. He simply began the work of skinning the animal, his movements sharp, angry, and final. The world outside seemed to sense the shift. The sky, once a brilliant blue, had turned a bruised, leaden gray. The wind began to moan through the pines, a low, mournful sound that quickly escalated into a vicious howl. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding torrent. A blizzard. They were trapped. For 2 days the storm raged, erasing the world, leaving only the claustrophobic reality of the small cabin. They moved around each other like ghosts, the unspoken secret of Martha's grave, a chasm between them. The tension was a living thing, coiling in the small space, tightening with every gust of wind that rattled the walls. On the 3rd day, Abigail's body surrendered. The days of travel, the emotional shock, and the relentless cold finally broke through her endurance. A shiver began in the marrow of her bones, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that soon consumed her. The room began to tilt and swim, the edges of her vision blurring into darkness. She collapsed. She drifted in a sea of fever awareness, coming in waves. She felt herself being lifted, his arms impossibly strong yet gentle, as he carried her to her cot. She felt a cool, damp cloth on her burning forehead, his huge, rough hands surprisingly tender. He was a shadow, moving in the dim light, a presence of immense, focused concern. He would press a cup of bitter, steaming liquid to her lips, his voice a low command. "Drink." In her delirium, she was a child again, small and afraid, and she whimpered a name she had not spoken in years. "Mama." The sound broke him. As she drifted back to a state of fragile lucidity, she found him sitting in the chair beside her cot, the storm a distant roar, the firelight casting long dancing shadows on the walls. He was watching her, his face no longer angry, but filled with a weary, heartbreaking grief. "Your mother." He began, his voice rough with disuse. She loved the mountains. Abigail could only stare, her mind struggling to catch up. Her name was Eleanor. He continued, his gaze lost in the flickering flames. She was Martha's dearest friend. "My Martha." He looked at Abigail then, and she saw the truth of his pain. "Your father. He was a cruel man even then. He saw her spirit as a thing to be broken. Before she died, Eleanor made me promise. She knew he would turn on you one day. She made me swear I would watch over you, that I would get you away when the time came." The words were a cascade, a dam of silence breaking after years. "The sale?" "It was a lie, Abigail. A charade to get you away from him without him raising an alarm and sending a posse after a runaway. He thinks you are my property. He will not look for you." The shocking plan in its entirety was laid bare in the dim, fire-lit cabin. It was not a plan of servitude. It was a plan of salvation. "I am not your owner," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "I am your guardian. I swore to your mother I would teach you to be strong, to survive on your own, and when you are ready you will be free to choose your own path, to go wherever you wish." The storm raged outside, a symphony of chaos. But inside the small cabin, the storm in Abigail's soul had finally impossibly broken. The man she believed to be her monster was her savior, and the name of her new reality was hope. The thaw came slowly then, all at once. The world, silenced and buried by the blizzard, began to breathe again. Water dripped from the eaves of the cabin, a steady rhythmic beat counting out the start of a new life. The snow receded, revealing the sleeping earth beneath, and with it the truth of Jedediah's promise began to take root in Abigail's soul. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer a wall of fear and intimidation, but a shared space of quiet understanding. The chasm of Martha's grave, which had once seemed a place of forbidden sorrow, was now a bridge. He was no longer her owner, the beast from the mountain. He was Jedediah. And she, in this small, secluded world, was simply Abigail. Her education began not with words, but with the earth itself. "A wolf steps in its own track," he said one morning, his voice a low rumble as he knelt in the damp soil. He pointed a thick finger at a series of prints near the creek. "One track, not two. He is efficient. He wastes nothing. You must learn the same." He taught her the language of the wilderness, a scripture written in broken twigs, overturned stones, and the subtle scent of pine on the wind. She learned which mushrooms would kill and which would nourish, which herbs would soothe a fever and which could staunch a bleeding wound. He showed her how to read the clouds, to feel the coming rain in the ache of her own bones, to find her way by the stars that glittered like a spill of cold diamonds in the vast, silent night. The girl who had once shattered a porcelain music box now learned to set a snare with a touch so delicate it would not disturb a single blade of grass. She grew strong. The mountain air, the hard work, and the simple, nourishing food stripped away the soft, sad flesh of her former life. Muscle hardened her arms and legs. The sun kissed her pale cheeks, leaving a healthy, confident glow. For the first time, her body was not a source of shame, but a source of power. It could carry her for miles, climb the steepest ridges, and hold a rifle steady. He taught her that, too. The rifle was a heavy, beautiful thing of oiled walnut and dark steel. It was his. It had likely been Martha's. It was far too large for her, the stock awkward against her shoulder, the kick, a brutal, bruising force that knocked the breath from her lungs. "Again," was all he would say, his voice patient, steady as she staggered back. She would grit her teeth, her shoulders screaming in protest, and lift the heavy barrel again. She learned to breathe, to squeeze the trigger, not pull it to become one with the cold, unforgiving logic of the machine. The day she hit the pine cone he had set on a distant stump, the clean, sharp thwack echoing through the valley. A sound of pure triumph, a laugh bubbled up out of her. It was a sound she had not heard from her own lips in years. It startled them both. Jedediah didn't smile, but the corners of his eyes crinkled in a way she was beginning to recognize as his own quiet form of approval. In the evenings, by the warm glow of the fire, the lessons turned inward. The silence, once a chasm, now became a comfortable quiet, punctuated by stories. Martha planted that garden, he said one night, staring into the flames, his voice soft with memory. She could make anything grow. Said the plants had their own songs if you knew how to listen. Abigail, emboldened by the shared peace, found her own voice. My mother, Eleanor. She loved to sing. Her voice was like the creek water after a rain. She told him of her mother's kindness of the brief sunlit years before she was gone, leaving Abigail alone with the gathering storm of her father's bitterness. He listened, his great head nodding slowly, his silence now a form of solace, not a threat. He was a guardian, a mentor, the father she'd always craved, born from a promise and wrapped in the skin of a bear. Spring arrived in a riot of green and gold, the mountain meadows bursting with wildflowers. Their life found a rhythm, a peaceful, healing harmony. The ghosts of their pasts were still there, but they no longer haunted the daylight hours. They had found a sanctuary. But the world outside had not forgotten them. One afternoon, while checking a line of snares far down the valley, Jedediah suddenly went still. His body became rigid, every line of it screaming a silent, violent alarm. He held up a hand, and Abigail froze behind him. He knelt, his eyes fixed on the muddy bank of the creek. He did not need to speak. She saw it too. It was a clear, sharp print pressed deep into the mud. Not the cloven hoof of a deer, not the soft pad of a wolf or a bear. It was the heel and sole of a boot. It was not his. A cold dread, a chilling echo of her past life, snaked its way around her heart. The piece was a fragile, beautiful illusion. A single footprint was all it took to shatter it. Someone had found them. The monster she had escaped was coming. The boot print was a wound in the earth. It lay beside the creek, sharp-edged and alien, a declaration of war against the quiet sanctuary they had built. The peace of the valley shattered the silence that had become a comfort, now filled with a low, humming dread. Jedediah's face settled back into the hard lines of a man who knew violence, his eyes constantly scanning the trees, his hand never far from the worn stock of his rifle. The guardian had become a sentinel. They did not run. They prepared. The cabin, once a place of discovery and healing, became a fortress. He barred the heavy door, checked the loads in his rifle with a quiet, deadly focus. He handed Abigail a small, heavy pistol, its steel cold and real in her hands. You know how to use it, he stated, not a question but a transference of trust. She nodded, her throat tight. The girl who had trembled at her own shadow was now being armed for a war against her own blood. The waiting was a slow, creeping poison. Every rustle of leaves, every cry of a blue jay was the sound of an approaching enemy. The old fear, the familiar gut-wrenching terror of her father, crept back from the dark corners of her mind. She could feel the phantom weight of his gaze, hear the cutting edge of his voice. But something was different now. The fear was a cold, sharp thing, yes, but it was not the cowering, helpless terror of a child. It was the calculated anxiety of a soldier before a battle, a soldier who knew her ground and the value of what she was defending. This cabin, this life, this strange, silent man who had shown her the meaning of home. She was no longer just a victim, she was a protector of the life she had found. They came at dawn, 3 figures emerging from the mist-shrouded pines like wraiths. Her father, Corbin, his fine town coat looking absurd and flimsy against the raw wilderness, his face a mask of pinched fury. Flanking him were two hired men, their faces hard and empty rifles held with a casual menace. They stopped a stone's throw from the cabin. The valley held its breath. Girl Corbin's voice was a whip crack, the same tone he had used a lifetime ago. It was a voice used for summoning a dog, not a daughter. "Get out here. Now. This foolishness is over." The cabin door creaked open. Jedediah stepped out, first his rifle held loosely at his side, his presence a silent, immovable mountain. Then came Abigail. She did not hide behind him. She stood beside him, the small pistol heavy in her hand, her gaze locked on her father. She saw him, truly saw him for the first time, not through a haze of fear, but with the clear, cold eyes of a survivor. She saw not a powerful patriarch, but a small, grasping man, his eyes darting with greed. "You have no business here, Corbin." Jedediah's voice rumbled the sound of an impending rock slide. Corbin scoffed, his gaze fixed on Abigail. "I have every business. She is my daughter, my property. I've come to take what is mine." He took a step forward. "I found your mother's letters, girl, about her family back east. There is money, an inheritance, your inheritance, and it will be managed by your legal guardian, me. There it was, not love, not duty, not even simple possession, just greed. A pathetic, hollow greed. He had not come for his daughter, he had come for a purse." The knowledge settled in Abigail not with the sting of betrayal, but with a profound, liberating clarity. The last chain broke. She took a step forward, away from the protective shadow of Jedediah. The pistol was still in her hand, but she knew she would not need it. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the whisper of the girl who had left his house. It was clear, steady, and it echoed with the strength of the mountains around them. "No," she said. Corbin froze, stunned by the simple, absolute defiance. "I am not your property," she continued, the words a river of truth held back for 16 years. "I was never your daughter. I was a burden you tolerated, a mirror for your own bitterness. And now I am just a key to a lockbox you want to pry open." She looked from her father's sputtering face to the uneasy expressions of the hired men. They were here for coin, not for a family reckoning. "This man," she said, gesturing to Jedediah, "kept a promise he made to my mother. He saved me. He taught me that strength is not about the power you hold over others. It is about the quiet resilience of your own soul. He showed me what a father is supposed to be." She raised her chin, her eyes clear and unwavering. "This is my home now, and you are not welcome here." It was over. There was no grand battle, no hail of bullets. Her words were the only shots fired, and they had struck their target with lethal precision. She had renounced him not with fear or anger, but with a calm, unshakable certainty of her own worth. His power, built on her fear and silence, crumbled into dust. Corbin stared, his face a ruin of disbelief and thwarted greed. He looked at Jedediah, who stood silent and immense, a silent promise of what would happen if he took another step. He looked at the hired guns, who now shifted their weight, their rifles seeming a little heavier, their purpose a lot less clear. He had lost. With a strangled curse, he turned and stalked back into the woods, his men following like beaten dogs. The valley was quiet again. The intruders were gone, their presence fading like a bad dream. The sun broke through the clouds, spilling golden light into the clearing. Jedediah looked at her, his Winter Creek eyes holding a question. The promise was fulfilled. The choice, as he had said it would be, was hers. The inheritance was real. She could go east to a new life of comfort and society. A life without him. Abigail looked around the clearing. She looked at the solid, honest logs of the cabin, at the small garden waiting for Martha's touch, at the grave beneath the tall pine. She looked at the tall, silent man who had bought her, saved her, and set her free. She had been sold from one house only to find her first true home. A smile, the first genuine, unfettered smile of her life, touched her lips. She laid the pistol on the porch railing. "I'm home," she said.